It was well past midnight when Jenna awoke with a start. Her room was bathed in an eerie silver glow from the full moon outside, casting elongated shadows across the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she tried to remember what had startled her. It was just a dream, she told herself, but the details of it were already slipping away, like sand through her fingers. She took a deep breath and turned onto her side, pulling the covers up to her chin. That was when she saw it. A dark figure standing in the corner of her room where the moonlight couldn't reach. The shape was humanoid but had no discernible features. No eyes, no mouth, no details, just darkness. It felt like the shadows themselves had coalesced into something sentient. Jenna froze, her eyes wide and unblinking. She wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but she knew deep down that it wasn't. Her entire body screamed at her to move, to run, but she was paralyzed by fear. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her, if watching was something it could do. Minutes felt like hours as Jenna lay there, her eyes locked on the shadow person. Then, as if summoned by her fear, it began to glide toward her bed. There was no sound, no footsteps, just a silent, horrifying glide. Jenna's breath quickened. She wanted to scream but couldn't force the sound past her lips. It was as if the presence had stolen her voice. The shadow reached the edge of her bed and stopped. It loomed over her, the darkness somehow even blacker than the unlit room. Jenna felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the air around her had turned poisonous. She closed her eyes, willing it to be a dream, willing herself to wake up. But when she opened them again, it was still there, closer now, leaning over her. She could feel its presence pressing down on her, suffocating her with its intensity. And then, she felt something else, a cold, icy touch on her arm. She gasped, the sound finally escaping her throat, but it was barely a whisper. The shadow's touch was like death itself, cold and draining, as if it were sucking the life out of her. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to pull away, but her body was leaden, too heavy to move. The shadow's touch traveled up her arm, reaching her shoulder, her neck. It was taking something from her. She could feel it, a piece of her soul maybe. The darkness around her seemed to thicken, the air growing heavy and thick. And then she heard it, a low, hissing whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It spoke in a language she didn't understand, guttural and ancient, like the creaking of old wood or the sigh of the wind through a graveyard. But she knew what it meant somehow. It was hungry. It wanted her. Just when she thought she couldn't take any more, that she would suffocate under the weight of its presence, the shadow withdrew. It melted back into the corner of her room, becoming once again just a dark shape among the other shadows. Jenna gasped for air, her body trembling violently. She felt weak, drained like she had run a marathon. For the rest of the night, she didn't dare close her eyes. She stayed curled up in her bed, watching the shadow in the corner. It didn't move again, but she knew it was still there, watching her with whatever it used for eyes. The first rays of dawn broke through the window, and the shadow seemed to dissolve into the light. Only then did she dare to move. The next day, she was a wreck. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even in broad daylight. She told herself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but deep down, she knew better. She tried to go about her day as normal, but everything felt off. Wrong, like she was slightly out of sync with the world around her. That night, she avoided going to bed for as long as she could. She kept every light in the house on, every door and window locked. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and she found herself back in her room, dreading what the night would bring. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to claim her. Hours passed, and just when she thought she might finally drift off, she heard it. the faintest whisper of movement in the corner of her room. Her heart stopped as she turned her head slowly, praying it wasn't there. But it was. The shadow person stood in the corner, darker and more solid than the night before. And this time, it wasn't alone. More shadows emerged from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, until there were at least 5 of them, all standing silently, watching her with their featureless faces. Jenna's breath hitched as the figures began to move, gliding toward her bed in a slow, predatory manner. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. They surrounded her bed, their darkness pressing in on her from all sides. One of them leaned down, its cold, empty face inches from hers. She felt the icy touch again, and then the whispering started. All of them speaking at once in that same incomprehensible language. She could feel herself slipping away, her vision dimming as they drained her, taking something vital from her. Her last thought before the darkness claimed her was that she would never wake up again. But she did wake up. The morning sun was streaming through her window and she was alone. Her body ached and she felt like she hadn't slept at all. But she was alive. She sat up, looking around her room, half expecting to see them still lurking in the corners. For the next few days, she barely slept. She tried everything, sleeping pills, staying at a friend's house, but nothing worked. Every night they came for her, the shadow people. Every night they drained a little more of her life away, leaving her weaker and weaker. She didn't know how much more she could take. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with her, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the shadows took everything. She started to wonder if she should just let them, if it would be easier than living in fear. And then, one night, she made a decision. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't hide. She would face them, whatever they were. She sat up in bed, waiting for them to come. The minutes ticked by, and she felt the air grow cold, felt the familiar dread wash over her. They came as she knew they would, emerging from the darkness to surround her bed. But this time, she didn't cower. She looked into the face of the nearest shadow and whispered, "What do you want?" For a moment, everything was silent. Then the shadow leaned closer, and she felt its icy breath on her face as it whispered back in that strange, guttural language. And though she still didn't understand the words, she knew what they meant. They wanted her, and she knew then that there was no escape, no running, no hiding, no fighting. The shadow people would take her sooner or later. She was theirs now. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was the shadow's face, so close to hers that she could almost see something within it, a flicker of something terrible, something hungry. And then there was nothing.